There are places in the Nevada desert where the earth itself seems to hold its breath. Places where the heat shimmer makes mirages of memory, and the silence stretches so thin you can hear your own heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. Peter found himself in such a place on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. The motel sign flickered against the dying light. Neon letters spelling Desert Rose in pink and blue, though half the bulbs had surrendered to the relentless sun years ago. Peter stood beside his rental car, staring up at something that shouldn't have been there. 12 feet off the ground, tangled in the satellite dish like some grotesque Christmas ornament, hung the carcass of a goat. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, his cruiser coughing dust clouds that hung in the still air like guilty secrets. He was a lean man with eyes that had seen too much, and when his flashlight beam found the goat, he didn't even flinch. "Damn coyotes," he muttered. Peter, who wrote tabloid stories under the pen name Peter Certendirk to keep his journalism dreams alive, couldn't help himself. Coyotes using trampolines these days? The sheriff's laugh was as insincere as his ridiculous explanation. That night, Peter sat on the motel's cracked patio, nursing a lukewarm beer and trying to piece together how he'd ended up in this godforsaken corner of Nevada. The claw marks on that goat, the silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water, the way everyone in town looked through him when he asked questions. He liked to think that everything, no matter how bizarre, had a reasonable explanation. He liked to think that it was his job to find those reasonable explanations and write about them. He liked to think that reasonable people would believe these reasonable explanations. But this wasn't one of those stories. It had started 3 days ago with an email that arrived in the middle of the night. Subject line, "He's back. Tonopah." Attached was a photograph, grainy, distorted, but unmistakably showing a winged figure perched on a billboard like some medieval gargoyle. Below it, a single line of text that had made Peter's blood run cold. "Find the doctor before it finds him." Peter had forwarded the email to Mary Clatch, his editor at the Strange Times, a discount supermarket tabloid that thrived on headlines like "Bigfoot elected mayor" and "Elvis statue found on Mars." Mary had once been nominated for a Pulitzer. Now she drank instant coffee from a stained mug and ran the only newsroom where the less believable a story sounded, the more likely it was to be true. Bat Boy, but darker, Peter had pitched her over the phone at midnight. How much darker? Mary had asked, already knowing she'd greenlight whatever he proposed. Dark enough to matter. She'd given him 3 days and a rental car. He'd promised her a story that would make people forget every Bat Boy joke they'd ever heard. It was all bluster. It was all smoke and mirrors salesmanship, but he knew Mary. He knew the kinds of stories that turned her on, and that's what he sold her. Sitting on that cracked patio, beer going warm in his hands, Peter wondered if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The call from Toby had come as Peter drove through the desert toward Tonopah, his researcher's voice crackling through the car's worn speakers like a transmission from another world. "You're not going to believe what I found," Toby said, and Peter could hear the excitement and alarm warring in his voice. Toby lived in a world of redacted documents and shadow organizations, connected dots that most people couldn't even see. He'd been digging into the Bat Boy story for years, treating it like the conspiracy theory it might actually be. "DARCA," Toby continued, "Desert Advanced Research and Containment Agency. Ever heard of them?" Peter hadn't. "Project Nocturne, shut down in 2006. I've got documents describing something called Subject 7XB. There's a name attached, Dr. Malcolm Vexler. No photos, no current address or phone. It's like he vanished." The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead, heat mirages turning the asphalt into liquid silver. "I'm sending you an MP3, Toby said. High-frequency tones. According to these files, 7XB was trained to respond to them." Peter's phone buzzed with the incoming file. "Toby, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe this Bat Boy thing isn't a joke. Maybe it never was." The line went dead, leaving Peter alone with the desert and a growing sense that he was driving towards something that would change everything. The gas station outside Tonopah was the kind of place that time forgot. Rusted pumps, sun-bleached signs, and a gift shop that seemed to exist in its own pocket dimension of roadside Americana. Peter filled his tank and decided to start his investigation inside. The shop was a temple to tourist kitsch. Postcards of desert sunsets, keychains shaped like cacti, and there, hanging on a spinning rack like some kind of cryptozoological lottery prize, Bat Boy merchandise. T-shirts, coffee mugs, even beef jerky packages with a cartoonish winged figure grinning from the label. The shop owner was a wiry man in his 60s with the kind of permanent sunburn that came from decades in the desert. His smile was wide and practiced, the smile of someone who'd learned to profit from the peculiar. "You hear about the Bat Boy?" he asked, eyeing Peter's press credentials. "Word travels fast. Fast as gossip can carry it." The man chuckled. "Name's Earl. I've been selling Bat Boy stuff for, 15 years now, ever since that first story hit the internet." Peter picked up a t-shirt, black cotton with a silhouette of something winged perched on a rock formation. "Any truth to the stories?" Earl's grin widened. "Truth's whatever sells t-shirts, friend. Got folks driving hundreds of miles just to buy a coffee mug with his picture on it. Hell, I even make my own jerky now. Bat Boy's Desert Delight. Secrets in the seasoning." "But have you ever actually seen anything? Heard any neighbors talk about encounters?" Earl's smile flickered just for a moment. "Mister, I've lived in this desert my whole life. You see plenty of things out there that don't make sense in daylight, but that don't mean they ain't real." He rang up the t-shirt Peter hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That'll be 1995. You wear that around town, folks'll know what you're after." Peter emerged from the shop clutching his purchase, feeling both foolish and oddly hopeful. The desert heat hit him like a physical blow, and he was fumbling for his car keys when a voice spoke behind him. "You with the papers?" Peter turned. A man in aviators and a windbreaker stood beside a dusty sedan. Military bearing, old service ring, the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was used to being obeyed. The man nodded toward the Bat Boy t-shirt in Peter's hands. "Doing a story on this Bat Boy thing, I imagine." Peter's blood chilled. He hadn't mentioned the story to anyone except Mary, Toby, and Earl. "How did you?" "Word travels fast in small towns." The man's smile was arctic. "Overheard you talking inside. I'd advise you to find a different story. People around here don't like nosy outsiders, especially reporters." Peter forced a laugh. "Good thing I'm a respected journalist, then." The man didn't laugh back. "The Bat Boy story is an urban legend, nothing more." Peter looked around at the empty desert, the dying town, the vast expanse of nothing stretching to every horizon. This place doesn't seem urban enough for an urban legend. Maybe we should call it a country yarn? Still no laugh. The man's eyes, hidden behind those aviators, seemed to bore into Peter's skull. "Take my advice, Mr. Certendirk. Find a different story." He walked away before Peter could ask how he knew his name. Peter spent the next 2 days playing detective in a town that seemed determined to forget its own mysteries. The diner on Main Street was the kind of place where conversations died when strangers walked in. Peter ordered coffee and pie from a waitress whose name tag read Dolores, and whose smile seemed welded in place. "Bat Boy?" she repeated when Peter asked, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who'd heard this question before. "Honey, only bat I know about is the one my husband swings at the softball games." The truckers at the counter snickered. One of them, a mountain of flannel and stubble, turned around. "You that reporter Earl mentioned? The one buying up all his t-shirts?" Peter nodded, suddenly aware of how foolish he must look. "Well, I'll tell you what," the trucker continued. "Bat Boy's probably hanging out with Bigfoot somewhere, playing poker with Elvis. You find him, you let me know. I got some questions for the king." The pattern repeated itself everywhere he went. The hardware store owner just shook his head and muttered something about city folk and their nonsense. At the thrift store, a cramped space filled with forgotten memories, Peter browsed through dusty electronics while questioning the teenage girl behind the counter. She had purple streaks in her hair and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Bat Boy?" she said, not looking up from her phone. "That's like from the internet, right? Some meme or whatever?" Peter picked up an old boombox, checking to see if it had an auxiliary input. "You've lived here long?" "My whole boring life." She finally looked at him, sizing him up. "You really think there's some bat creature flying around out there?" "I'm trying to find out." She shrugged. "My grandmother used to tell stories about things in the desert, said the old-timers saw stuff during the atomic tests. Weird animals, people who weren't quite people anymore. She paused. Course, Grandma also said the government put chemicals in the water to make us stupid, so Peter tested the boombox's buttons. It seemed to work. This thing still play music? $20 and you can find out. Comes with a warranty. If it breaks, you get to keep both pieces. For the first time in 2 days, Peter smiled. By the second evening, Peter was starting to wonder if he'd chased a ghost story into the middle of nowhere. He sat in his motel room, staring at the Batboy t-shirt he'd bought from Earl, feeling like a fraud in a place that specialized in making fools of outsiders. He cracked open a beer when his phone buzzed at him. Another email from his anonymous tipster. This message only contained text. It simply read, "He's been seen several times at the old El Rey Drive-In." No address was given. Peter spent the better part of an hour searching the internet for the El Rey Drive-In Theater. Turns out, El Rey is just about the most common name for a movie theater in the United States. He found tons of pictures, but only a couple from Tonopah. None of them had an address. He took his beer down to the front desk. Tracy was unpacking a box of office supplies when Peter entered. She spun around and flicked her hair out like she was in a slow-motion music video. As cool as that was, what really caught his eye was her lack of one. She wore a black eye patch over her left eye. He thought maybe she had been in an accident but couldn't see any scars. She noticed him looking. "Oh, it's nothing. It's a new moon tonight." Peter waited for the rest of the story, but there wasn't one. "Sorry, I've got to know," he asked. "Oh, right. I keep this eye covered for the 8 hours before sunset, and when the sun goes down, it's already adjusted. I'm a stargazer. A bunch of us go out and watch the sky." "Does that work?" he asked. "Oh, yeah." She nodded aggressively. "Cool." He read off his phone. "Do you know where the old El Rey Drive-In is? I can't seem to find it on Google." She wrote directions to the old El Rey on a motel notepad, then invited him to stargaze with her that night. "I'd love to, but I've got an appointment tonight." "Say, aren't you guys worried about Batboy out in the desert? I hear he's been spotted recently," he said. A chuckle escaped from her chest. "Yeah. Okay." The chuckle escaped again and quickly developed into a full laugh. "I heard about you." The laughing continued. Peter tossed the empty can into the recycle bin and returned to his room. The abandoned drive-in theater sat like a graveyard of dreams on the outskirts of Tonopah. Rusted speaker posts jutted from cracked asphalt like tombstones, and the massive screen, once white as hope, now bore the scars of wind and sand and time. Peter had driven here following Tracy's directions. As dusk painted the sky the color of old blood, he placed the thrift store boombox on the cracked concession stand and plugged in his phone. The ultrasonic tones began to play, or at least he thought they were. The phone said it was playing, but the MP3 contained frequencies well beyond the range of human hearing. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bones. Then, wing beats, not the frantic flutter of a bird, but something larger, deliberate, the sound of leather cutting through air with predatory grace. Peter's hands shook as he fumbled with his camera. The figure that landed on the drive-in screen was impossibly tall and impossibly thin, wrapped in shadows and a ragged hoodie that had seen better decades. Wings, not feathered but membranous like a bat's, folded against a frame that looked assembled from spare parts and nightmares. The creature then leapt from the screen and gracefully glided to within yards of Peter. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the dying light. When the creature finally spoke, its words were thick and garbled, filtered through teeth that didn't quite fit a human mouth. Then it paused, reached up, and removed what Peter realized was an orthodontic retainer. "Sorry," the creature said, its voice now perfectly clear. "They told me if I didn't wear it, my teeth would go back to being crooked." A pause. A smile that was all sharp edges. "Can't have that. Might not get that modeling career I've always wanted." His name was Nick, not Batboy, not Subject 7XB, just Nick. He'd been raised in the DARCA facility, he explained, sitting cross-legged on the hood of Peter's rental car like this was the most natural thing in the world. He wasn't sure where he'd been born. "Mom said the family was from Indiana," he said with that same dry smile, "but I don't really think I look Indian." The photograph he showed Peter was old and creased, a family portrait from before the world went wrong. A woman with kind eyes, Three boys, all about the same age, stood in front of their mother, each one a carbon copy of Nick, and standing behind them, a man in a white lab coat with eyes like winter. Dr. Malcolm Wexler. He created us, Nick said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent alone in the desert. Weaponized us. My brothers. They didn't make it through the experiments. Peter's mouth went dry. He recognized Wexler immediately, the man at the gas station. The stranger in aviators who'd warned him away from the story, who'd claimed Batboy was nothing but an urban legend. Nick had been surviving on his own since 2006, when a power failure had given him the chance to escape. 18 years in the desert, living in an old fallout shelter, hunting feral goats and making jerky, calling himself a desert Rambo, with the kind of gallows humor that comes from staring death in the face every day. He wanted to destroy what was left of the DARCA facility. He wanted to make Wexler pay for what he'd done. He's good at hiding, but something tells me you've already met. He made contact, didn't he? Nick inched closer to Peter, his red eyes open wide with excitement. I need to talk to him. Do you know how to find him? Peter asked. If I did, I wouldn't have contacted you. I've been looking since I escaped. He won't go out at night, and I can't exactly walk down Main Street during the day. Peter could see something calculating in those inhuman eyes. Plans within plans. Secrets wrapped in secrets. I'm not going to help you kill him, if that's what you're after. Nick threw up his hands. Hey, I never said anything about murder. I just want his lies exposed. He needs to face the consequences for what he's done to me. My brothers, my mother. It's not fair that he gets to walk free on this earth while I have to hide in the cracks and caves. Before Nick melted back into the shadows, he made one request. Could you stop calling me Batboy? I'm 33 years old. Maybe try Batman? Peter had chuckled despite everything. I'm not sure the lawyers will let us do that. Copyright issues. Nick shrugged. Shouldn't be a problem. He's Batman. I'm Batman. It's not the same, he said, as if it were that simple. As if anything about this was simple. The call came that night as Peter sat in his motel room, staring at a six-pack of beer and trying to process everything he'd learned. The phone rang once, sharp as a gunshot in the desert silence. Mr. Certendirk. Wexler's voice was smooth as silk, cold as winter. I hear you've been talking to Nick. Peter's blood turned to ice water. Dr. Wexler? He's dangerous, violent. The experiments, they changed him, made him unstable. You shouldn't trust him. But Peter had looked into Nick's eyes, had seen the pain there, the loneliness, the desperate hunger for something that looked like justice. If Nick was violent, it was the violence of a caged animal finally finding its freedom. We go to press in 24 hours. Give me an interview, otherwise the story is what he's told me, Peter explained. This is your chance to do some damage control. The silence stretched between them for an eternity. The old compound, Wexler said finally. Tomorrow morning at 8, come alone. The line went dead. The DARCA facility looked like something from low-budget sci-fi flick. Concrete bunkers rising from the desert floor like geometric tumors, connected by walkways that cast twisted shadows in the morning light. Most of it had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, left to the mercy of wind and sand and the slow, patient work of decay. Wexler was waiting by the main gate, a briefcase at his feet that Peter suspected contained more than just paperwork. He looked older than he had at the gas station, more fragile, like a man carrying the weight of too many terrible decisions. You came, Wexler said. I'm a journalist. This is what we do. Peter started recording on his phone. Tell me about Project Nocturne. And Wexler talked. He talked about the arms race that never ended, about enemies who were developing biological weapons that could end civilization as they knew it. He talked about the need to fight fire with fire to create something that could match the monsters lurking in laboratories across the world. You don't think they're doing the same? He said, his voice carrying a terrible certainty. Where do you think COVID came from? Peter couldn't tell if the man was deluded or terrifyingly informed. We weren't preparing to dominate, Wexler continued. We were preparing to survive. You have no idea what's coming. A shiver of cold shot up Peter's spine despite the oppressive desert heat. If your work was so important, why did they shut you down? He asked. It was all political. We were funded across multiple administrations, but after Nick ran away and the press picked up the story, the program became an embarrassment. Nobody in Washington was willing to stand behind the work. Wexler looked off into the distance, unable to make eye contact. Why did you stick around? Why not move on to a new project? Something that they would fund? Peter asked. Because my work here isn't finished, Wexler explained. The cold shiver in Peter's spine became an electric shock. He finally turned to see what Wexler had been looking at in the distance. A dust cloud approached on the dirt road, 3 unmarked vehicles, a strike team in tactical gear, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Flak jackets, tranquilizer guns, net cannons. They spread out around the compound like spiders spinning a web. Who are these guys? Peter asked. Wexler smiled. Insurance. That's when Nick dropped from the sky. He moved like liquid shadow, like death given wings and purpose. One moment, the desert was empty except for the strike team. The next, chaos erupted in a ballet of violence that was beautiful and terrible to behold. Nick swept through them like a force of nature, using his wings to disorient, his inhuman agility to stay ahead of their weapons. A tranquilizer dart flew where he'd been a heartbeat before. The net cannon fired, but Nick was already rolling, and the net caught 2 agents instead of 1 winged figure. In under a minute, the entire strike team was unconscious or restrained. Nick, wait, Peter called out. We agree to let Wexler talk. Nick turned, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. He did. Before Peter could protest, Nick grabbed Wexler and launched himself into the air. They disappeared into the rising sun, heading toward what Peter now realized was an old fallout shelter built into a nearby hillside. The heavy door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Minutes later, Nick emerged alone. He scratched a message in the dirt with one clawed finger. Home. Peter didn't wait around. He hopped into his car and sped back down the dirt road to the highway. He didn't know what the strike team would do after they recovered. He didn't want to know. All that he knew was he had his story. He didn't have the truth, but he was getting used to that. The more of these stories he investigated, the more he realized that the truth was as flexible as silly putty and just about as reliable. But the thought lingered like smoke in his lungs as he drove back to the motel. Peter had been played from the very beginning. Nick needed a witness to make sure the world knew what had been done to him and his brothers, someone to watch as he finally got his revenge. Peter filed his story that night, pouring everything onto the page, the truth, the horror, the terrible beauty of Nick's quest for justice. He wrote about a creature who was more human than the humans who had created him, about the price of playing God in a world that already had too many monsters. Mary Clatch published it under the headline, Bat Boy Breaks Loose, Demands Netflix Deal. She'd gutted the nuance, removed the empathy, turned Nick's tragedy into tabloid comedy. When Peter protested, she shrugged. The truth's like a corpse, Pete. You gotta dress it up or no one wants to see it. Peter moved all his recordings and photos into a hidden folder on his laptop. He labeled it Grandma's Recipes and stared at it for a long moment before closing the lid. Someday, he said to the empty room, the real story would wait. It would have to. On his last night in the desert, Peter sat on a plastic lawn chair outside his motel room, the heat still pressed against him like a living thing, and the lights on the nearby billboard flickered faintly in the distance, just another sign of how broken this world really is. Tracy exited the motel's tiny lobby with a cooler of ice and cold beer. She sat next to him and handed him a drink. Life's too short for warm beer, she said, as if professing something deeply philosophical. A flutter of movement caught Peter's eye. Nick glided silently overhead, silhouetted against the star-filled sky like something from a dream or a nightmare. Without looking up, Tracy casually tossed one of her beers into the air. Nick snatched it mid-flight with one clawed hand, banking off into the darkness without a sound. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, as she suppressed a smile. "You knew about him this whole time and you never said anything?" "You asked if I was afraid of him," she said, as if that explained everything. Peter examined her for a long moment, waiting for the rest of the story, which never came. "I gotta know." She cut him off. "Spend enough time out there, and you'll see it all. Your problem is you don't want to put in the time." Peter watched her for a bit longer, trying to figure her out. He gave up and returned his gaze to the open expanse beyond the motel's parking lot. He chuckled to himself and took another sip of his ice-cold beer. The desert night stretched out around him. vast and patient, and full of secrets that would never see the light of day. Somewhere in the darkness, a creature that had once been called Batboy was finally free. Somewhere else, in a concrete tomb that smelled of jerky and regret, a doctor was learning what it felt like to be caged. And somewhere between truth and legend, between justice and revenge, Peter Certendirk had found the story of a lifetime. A story he would never be able to tell. The kind of story that haunts you long after the last word is spoken, long after the campfire burns down to ashes and the desert wind carries the smoke away into the endless night. Some stories, after all, are too true to believe, and those are the ones that matter most.